Well, good morning, everyone. We are in a book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to finish up chapter 3 today. I thought I'd start off with a story. The scene is a courtroom. And in the courtroom, there is a police officer on the stand, and he's being grilled by the defense attorney. And he asks him, he says, do you trust your fellow police officers? He says, absolutely. With your life? Yes. With your property? Yes. With everything you have? Yes, I trust them. He said, let me ask you something. Do you change in the police locker room? Yes, I do. When you leave that locker room, do you put a lock on the lock? He said, yes, I do. And he said, well, how can you say you trust your fellow officers? He said, well, the station I'm at is connected to the courthouse, and a lot of lawyers go through there on their way to the... And I started off with this because it seems so often in our justice system, we are less interested in justice than we are with winning the case. Remember, and what was his name? Ethan Couch, 2013. He and some friends stole some beer from a store. They drank that up. They smoked some pot, and then he went out driving the car, killed 4 people. One of them, another person, was paralyzed for life, and he received, as you might recall, 10 years of probation. And the defense that they offered is, look, he is a child of rich parents who never disciplined him. He grew up in all of this. They always bought his way out, so he had this expectation, and it was deemed the affluenza defense. He's affluent, and so they let him off. From the perspective of the world, doesn't it often seems that when it comes to the scales of justice, injustice has its thumb on the scale, that there's not always this sense of right and wrong, but take heart, because in the end, God will prevail. To set the context, if you were here last week, just a quick review. Number 1, don't try to figure God out. Just trust God. In verse 11, he said this, He's going to make everything beautiful in His time. We also saw that we should consider all things, everything, our work, our food, our drink, as a gift from God. Verse 13, and finally, we saw last week, God is absolutely sovereign over all things. People, places, things. As verse 14 says, God has done it. Today, we're going to finish chapter 3. We're going to start in verses 16 and 17. Would you look there as I read, starting in verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. Solomon, as he goes through this, you might have noticed, he's asking the hard questions of life. Why does it seem that the bad guys sometimes are winning? Now, I just want to encourage all of us in our questioning. This is me speaking personally. I have more respect for the person who looks at it and asks the hard questions because they want to know, rather than just blind faith. God doesn't call us for blind faith. We need a reasoned and informed faith, and that's what he's doing here. And notice we see this phrase as it starts out, life under the sun. That's a phrase that we see 29 times in this book, and it describes this life of meaninglessness, of empty. Life is a vapor, a cloud, a soap bubble that's gone. And it's from this vantage point, the problem is we're looking at our visible circumstances, and life under the sun does not take God into account. It's when we look over the sun that life begins to make sense. Here we're looking at this issue of justice. There's a phrase that you might have heard that I think kind of applies to this. Man's inhumanity to man. There's this idea that justice is not prevailing. Wicked people seem to be winning. In my introduction, I mentioned a case of true gross injustice. And so we ask ourselves, what is justice? How do we know what justice is? Where do we get this idea of right and wrong? I think it starts off because it's hardwired into us. We have a built-in, God-given understanding of right and wrong. The Apostle Paul puts it this way in Romans 2, verse 15. They, and in context this is the pagans, the Gentiles, show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their consciences also bear witness, and their conflicting thoughts either accuse or even excuse them. So the idea is, even if you don't have the Bible, you know right from wrong. And we know this from culture. Every culture, murder's wrong. Every culture, theft is wrong. Even from childhood, we see this play itself out. I think some of the first words that children, when they're playing together, learn to say is this: "That's not fair." And as parents, what do we say? Nobody said life was fair. Exactly. We have an inborn sense of right and wrong, justice and injustice. And so if we have this, why is it that sometimes the world seems to be so unjust? In a word, it's this: the problem is sin. And the people involved in this are using the system to their benefit, satisfying their sin because their desire for sin outweighs their desire for true justice. And then he takes it even further, Solomon does, in his argument. He says where you would expect fairness, it's absent. That's his judicial system. This is not a new phenomenon. You know, you see this in the New Testament. In the book of James, he says this: "But you," this is the rich, "have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court?" This is what I would refer to as the golden rule according to James. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. And, sorry. Caffeinated up. And he says, and there's wickedness where there ought to be justice, and where righteousness should be demonstrated, there's wickedness. Justice has left the building. Wickedness happens when the guilty go free and unpunished. And this isn't just true for the violent criminal on the street, the person who uses a knife or a gun or violence, but also for the white-collar criminal, people who would use a pen or a computer to steal. We get upset when murderers get off on technicalities, when there are inane verdicts by juries. People or corporations with tremendous wealth who use their resources to escape justice. And to be sure, this isn't always the case. But it is becoming, by my observation, less and less rare that true justice is taking place. And on the other hand, there are the truly innocent who get convicted. The righteous who are, according to the court system, declared guilty. This can happen for a variety of reasons. People may testify falsely against us. It may be that we don't have the resources to mount a defense and have to rely, not that public defenders are not sufficient, but if you have the money, you can buy the best defense, and you can't always do that. The state has tremendous resources at their disposal to come against you. Again, this isn't always the case, but why does it seem so often that the system seems rigged? And part of Solomon's frustration is this: we can see that it's not right. Why isn't something being done about it? Gary and I have this love of Mark Twain, and one of his expressions is, everyone complains about the weather, nobody does anything about it. Same idea here. We have this justice system that seems to be broken, and no one's doing anything. Martin Luther, in his commentary on this passage, put it this way: Solomon is not complaining because there's wickedness in the place of justice, but because the wickedness in the place of justice cannot be corrected. When the halls of justice become corridors of corruption, where can justice be found? Verse 17, he says, "I said in my heart." I just love that phrase, and he says it twice in this passage, and he begins to look inside to what he knows to be true about life and about God. He's beginning those steps of looking over the sun, if you will. There is, in the end, justice. As he says in verse 17, there is a time for every matter. God's going to judge. It's going to happen. It doesn't happen always in the time that we wish, though, does it? I had some examples from Scripture that kind of came to my mind as I put this together. In the Old Testament, probably, in my view, one of the most wicked kings of Israel, this is the northern part, was Ahab. He was a bad guy, married Jezebel. One day, he had this sort of bad attitude, and Jezebel comes to him and says, what's the matter, Ahab? He said, Naboth has this vineyard, and I really want that vineyard, but he won't sell it to me. And she says, no problem, I'll take care of it. And so she has a banquet, and she invites a couple of nefarious characters, and they go to the banquet, and these people lie about him. And they say, Naboth blasphemed the Lord. And the penalty for that in the Old Testament was death. So they took Naboth out, they stoned him to death, and Ahab gets the vineyard. That's injustice. But it doesn't go on forever. Sometimes we see it in this lifetime. You might remember Ahab was later killed in battle. In fact, he dressed like a regular soldier to avoid it, but you cannot avoid God's arrows when they come at you. Justice. But Jezebel, who was even worse in many ways than Ahab, was chased down to a town by Jehu, the king, after Ahab. She ran up into a tower. They called and they threw her out of the tower, and Jehu's horse trampled her to death. Justice. See, you cannot outrun God's justice. You might remember before Judah was taken captive to Babylon, they had been warned by the prophets over and over, not only about apostasy and idol worship. I think often we think that was their main sin. Bad as that was, if you read particularly the prophets and the minor prophets over and over again, what you see is you are unjust. You're abusing the poor. You're taking advantage of the system. Do right. Do just by these people. They did not do that. And so God, in his providence, brings Nebuchadnezzar over, destroys the city, takes them all, I shouldn't say takes them all captive, takes many captive. And there's a verse in Jeremiah that just, I'll be honest with you, it warms my heart because there's justice. And it's this. Jeremiah 39:10. This is the commander, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left in the land of Judah some of the poor people who owned nothing and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time. God's justice, it evens out. Even though they had been abused all this time, God took the people who owned that, banished them to Babylon, and says to the poor, here, free, it's yours, take it. You see how eventually God balances out the scales. In Matthew 25, Jesus talks about the separation of the sheep and the goats. I should say sheep and the goats, because the sheep will be on his right, the goats on his left, the sheep to everlasting happiness and joy with the Lord, and the goats to eternal punishment, and finally the great white throne of judgment, where everyone will appear before Jesus Christ, and those whose names are not written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. The first death is physical death. The second death is not physical, it's spiritual. And Jesus said there will be a forever separation between them and God. It should give us a great deal of peace and joy and confidence knowing this. Eventually, one way or the other, God will balance the scales. God loves justice. He will make everything right. The wicked will get what is coming to them. The righteous will get what's coming to them. And who are the righteous? Not the good people, because I'm not one of them. It's those who have been made righteous by the blood of Christ. So that because of his sacrifice, he then sees us as pure and holy and righteous in his sight. Some people would say, well, this is Old Testament. How were they saved? The same way Abraham was. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so these saints who are trusting in the Messiah who's to come are saved, as are we. In the end, the scales are going to be perfectly balanced. There's an area of study known as philosophy. Philosophy literally is the love of wisdom. And it generally seeks to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? And our next section tells us, in a nutshell, it's dress rehearsal for the afterlife. Every living thing, whether man or beast, is going to die. Let's look at verses 18 through 21. I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God was testing them, that they may see that they are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man, what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward, and the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth? He's saying, look, everyone and everything is going to die. And he says he's testing us. God is testing the hearts of men. Now, it's not a pass-fail type of test. That's not what's going on here. What it means is God is allowing us to actually examine ourselves to test our own character. See, God doesn't need to examine us to understand who we are because He already knows us perfectly. He is saying, look at yourself. Examine your own heart. He wants you to know, do I have godly character and a good understanding? And the object of the testing is to see how we compare between ourselves and initially what he calls the beasts. Beasts are non-living human animals. Now, when we first read through this, if we're not careful, you can almost come away with a Darwinian understanding. Right? There's no difference between men and animals. We all came from the same primordial stew. Lightning bolt hit it, and somehow, automagically, things just kind of appeared. They would say there's no difference between a human being and a giraffe. But we know biblically this isn't true, is it? You know, humans were made, according to Psalm 8:5, a little lower than the angels. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 6:3 that we are actually going to judge the angels that fell. Humans are the only thing created in the image and likeness of God. We are distinctly different in this way. And humans are the only beings for whom Jesus Christ died. He didn't die for cats. He didn't die for dogs. He didn't die for parrots. He died for human beings. If we go back into verse 18 to understand the context, the great equalizer for men and for animals is death. There's going to come a time when all people, all animals die. There is that moment when we will expend our final breath. All living beings will return to dust. Mankind has zero advantage over the animal kingdom in terms of death. Death is the equal opportunity employer. For the moment, it seems as if he's questioning, is there even an afterlife? If you read it just straight out. And he's saying, who knows if we ascend? Who knows if the animals descend? We don't simply know. And we wonder, how can a man of Solomon's wisdom even ask such questions? I think these are essential questions. I think these are questions that we need to ask ourselves, that we have to drive to the right answer. Later in the book, he'll come to an understanding. I'm going to give you sort of the end as a beginning. In 11:5, he says this, "You do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with a child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything." So here he says, look, there's a spirit that comes from God at birth to all humans. And then at the end he says this in 12:7, "And the dust to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." So there is hope, but he's right now asking the hard questions. He affirms that the spirit goes to God. For the time being, what he's driving us to do, the readers, is to think about eternity with this event in mind. It's been my observation, and there are many more, so you can, this is my opinion, I want to state that clearly, you can reject it if you wish, but I think there's three general ways that people consider death when they think about this moment. Number one, humor. If we can laugh about it, then it sort of lightens the load. Comic Martin Mull said this: death is a part of life. It's the very last part. And we say, okay, well, maybe it's not so bad if it can be funny. The second way that some people deal with it is they just determine they're not going to think about it. If I don't think about it, then everything will be all right. You can not think about it all you want. It's still coming. The third is this: face the reality of it. And then live our lives in accordance with that reality. There's an order of monks. They're called Trappists. They're the Benedictine order. And they have an interesting tradition. They will establish a monastery. And outside of that monastery, they will then set up a graveyard. And in that graveyard, they will dig one grave. And then they will go out every morning, and they will gather around that grave, and they will look down into it, realizing that's where we're going. Live today as if tonight I'll be in that hole. And when one of their number dies, they bury him, and then they dig the next hole, and then they go out there every morning, just as a daily reminder, this is where you're going. Live your life accordingly. If no one's getting out alive, we ought to live for eternity. Let's look at verse 22. So I saw there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? We aren't dead yet, so enjoy the task that God has given us. Verse 22. This is somewhat of a repeat of verse 13. Verse 13 says it's nothing better to do than to eat and drink and enjoy our work. This is a gift from God. Work is a gift from God. We should revel in it. We should rejoice in it. We should delight that work. Now, I would venture to say that probably most of us don't wake up and say, oh joy, I get to go to work. Now, if you ever had to struggle for a period without a job, you probably do, at least for a couple of weeks. And then reality sets in. I've often said that there are only two good jobs in America. Only two. And they're these: the one you just left and the one you're going to. All the rest of them are horrible. And let me just demonstrate for you. Gary is in aerospace. He'll agree with this. When I was in the aerospace industry, we referred to ourselves as aerospace gypsies. And the term comes from this: you work a contract until that contract expires, then they don't have anything, so up pops another one, and so I'm on the B1, and then the B2 is at Northrop. So we all go over there. And you just kind of go from company to company, in these different projects. And I observed something very early on in my career with aerospace. You'd be there, and then somebody said, hey, I just got an offer letter from Northrop. I'm going over there, and I can't wait. Boy, this place is horrible. I hate this, and they don't have that over here. And over there it's going to be so much better. And they just talk about Northrop or Rockwell like it was just, terrible, terrible, terrible place. And then, eventually I get my offer letter, and I go over to join them. Same guys. This place is horrible. We didn't have to put up with this at Rockwell. It was great over there. What's the difference? Okay, it's the attitude. It's what we bring to it. If we look at it as God says it is, it's a gift. It's a joy. We rejoice in the ability to work. There's a song from the 1960s. I won't sing it because I love you guys too much. But there's a song from the 60s. It was by the Vogues. Some of you gray hairs will remember it. But it just really, I just loved it. Even then, I love it now. I still listen to it once a week. Up every morning just to keep a job. I gotta fight my way through the hustle and mob. Oops, Turn it back on. Sounds of the city pounding in my brain while another day goes down the drain. But it's a 5 o'clock world when the whistle blows. No one owns a piece of my time. And there's a 5 o'clock me inside my clothes, thinking that the world's just fine. So the idea is, it's terrible, but 5 o'clock is coming. See, that's the wrong attitude to take to work. The right attitude to take to work. And I mean, even if you're retired, you got to be doing something. And when you doing that, you take it with the idea, look what God has done for me. The gift that He's given me so that I can serve. Now, some of us at work is mind-numbing, drudgery, and you ask yourself, well, how do I actually do that? How do I get to the point where I consider life to be a joy? Here's 3 things that I'm going to suggest. Number 1, appropriate these verses. Make them true for you. Understand, look, this is something God has given me to do. How blessed I am that He has given me something, that I have these abilities. And I can use these for Him and for His glory. Secondly, if the giver is God, then we can honor God by honoring those who employ us. Doing what they say, when they say, in the manner in which they say it, provided, of course, it's within the context of what the Bible allows. I've shared this verse before, but my work verse when I became a Christian was Colossians 3:23 and 24. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as though serving the Lord. For it is from the Lord that you receive the inheritance and the reward. Listen, it's the Lord Jesus Christ you're serving. So when you go to work with that attitude, then you have, wow, I'm serving Jesus. Not Jim or Mary or Bob. It's by extension them, but it's really the Lord that we are serving. Third, stop thinking of work as the means by which we can bless ourselves and the means by which we can use that to bless others. Now, there's nothing wrong spiritually with wanting a house and a car. These are necessary, but let's be careful to distinguish between our wants and our needs. And to have the right and proper motivation that says, you know what? God has blessed me with abilities. I get to go to work today, and I'm going to use part of that to send on these missions. You know, this is something that I think about, and when Karen and I are faithful in our giving, is, you know what? You know why these lights are on? Well, it's not because the power companies generate and they give it for nothing. It's because people give to the church. Do you know why we have materials for our children's ministries? Because people gave to the church and we purchased those and we are leading the next generation to Jesus Christ. We have missionaries every week here that we talk about. How are they out in the field? Well, it's because we are providing the means for them to do it, to take Jesus to Jerusalem, all Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Work is not something that's just to keep us off the streets and out of the pool halls. There is a higher purpose to it. And we need to apply these principles to that. It's a means that we provide for ourselves, for our families, for our churches, and for the global church at large. Too many Northrop stories today, I know, but I was in a project engineering group, and we were at the time marveling at just the lack of justice. Just like, why, things don't go right, and punishment doesn't seem to be equal, and some people get this, and some people get that. And one of my fellow engineers, in his spare time, I couldn't believe this, he designed a spanking machine. Okay? And the perpetrator would be strapped down to this thing, right? And he designed it such that it would take the perpetrator's height, weight, and body BMI into account, so the skinny person did not feel more pain than the heavier person. See? So it would be an exact hydraulically activated mechanism that would give you the exact right punishment. And I thought it was fabulous. And then over time, whenever we saw injustice in the newspaper, you didn't have to say, you just said 2 words, spanking machine. And everybody knew, okay? Well, there's no spanking machine yet. They haven't invented that. It would be wonderful, but there isn't. And as long as we're in this world, there's going to be injustice. That's part of life. Don't be discouraged. Be encouraged, because in the end, God is going to balance the scales. There will ultimately be justice. Sometimes it seems like there's no justice. It's just us. Take the long view. And in the meantime, enjoy the work that's to do. Amen?